What's something your parents believe that you don't?
When my family rolled their suitcases to the door and told me, with those practiced smiles that land between kindness and condescension, to focus on my studies while they enjoyed a week at a beach resort with bottomless margaritas and sunset photos engineered for maximum likes. I nodded like the dutiful daughter they trained me to be, even as something in my chest slid into place with a click I had not heard before, a quiet mechanical decision that said, if I am background furniture in this house, then I will choose whether I am a lamp or a live wire, and if they want me to be invisible, I will show them what invisible actually means. They made a whole show of pretending it was a sacrifice for my own good, with my mother reciting a speech she must have practiced while packing her new floppy hat, telling me that discipline builds character and that the resort crowds would only distract me from my goals, while my father added the usual comments about how the rates were better for a double room than a triple, and how he did not want to waste money on a bed I would barely use, and my sister Brooke, polished, photogenic, and permanently convinced that the world was a room where she should always stand closest to the mirror, laughed in that breezy way of hers and hugged me as if she were passing me a charity blanket at a fundraiser, murmuring that I should think of their vacation as motivation, because if I worked hard enough now, I could afford my own trip someday, maybe a quiet little getaway where I could sit under an umbrella and read something smart. I made tea I did not need, just to keep my hands steady, and I watched their ride pull out of the driveway while a wild, ridiculous thought rose up like a balloon I was not sure I wanted to catch, namely that if they left me out like a stray chair on the curb, they had given me a kind of permission, because once a thing is declared unwanted, the rules about it become blurry, and with blurriness comes freedom, and with freedom comes the option to do something other than cry on my textbook and send polite thumbs-up replies to their beach updates. The first day passed in a long ribbon of quiet where I let the house exhale, walked from room to room without shoes, and took an inventory not of possessions but of patterns, because families are predictable creatures and mine had routines that never changed. Like the shared cloud album that automatically absorbed every photo taken by anyone whose phone had been invited when we set up our holiday memory system years ago, or the kitchen calendar that my mother photographed each month for archiving, or the nightly habit my father had of pushing his pictures to his laptop so he could adjust the lighting and sharpen the edges until even our faces looked like they had been ironed. I opened the laptop, found the backup folders, and stared at the swollen archive with that balloon idea floating higher and higher until I reached up and grabbed the string. The hook landed not on a sharp, vindictive impulse, but on something stubborn and almost clinical, a desire to measure the exact circumference of my absence, because if I have been told for years that my presence is a problem, too serious, too opinionated, too much, then perhaps the precise experiment is to remove it and observe the reactions, and since they wanted me to focus on my studies, I would do that in the grimmest, most literal way by studying them as if they were a case file, a family unit presented for analysis, and if that sounds cold, then maybe you have never felt the strange heat that rises when your life is treated like a supporting role in someone else's slideshow. I started small and clean, copying their newest uploads to a private folder, and then I opened the shared space where the resort photos landed in real time, cocktails with decorative leaves, ocean horizons that looked suspiciously like stock images, Brooke in a white sundress holding a straw bag that might as well have been labeled "Look at me," and my parents posed with that specific stiffness that families use when they want to signal we are doing great, thanks for asking, and I began to edit. With the patience I never managed to summon for group projects, not altering the scenes exactly but adjusting them until the composition no longer hinted at me, which, if you have never done it, requires an unforgiving eye. Because even an empty chair can testify that someone was supposed to sit there, and even a shadow curling across a picnic table can whisper a name. I removed my reflection from Brooke's mirrored sunglasses in an old 4th of July album and felt, with the smallest shock, a dizzied sense of control, not the cartoon version of revenge with loud music and red lipstick, but a quiet redesign of history in which the overlooked person stops being the smudge on the lens and becomes the person holding the camera, while every image rearranges itself to comply. I brushed out my hand from the edge of a family selfie taken at a fall festival then. removed the sweater tied around my waist in a pumpkin patch where I had been the one to carry the heavy carved monsters to the car, then erased my blurred silhouette in a Thanksgiving kitchen shot, and the more I worked, the more I recognized how often I had been present only as labor or filler, or the person to blame when the Wi-Fi lagged. If you think I sound dramatic, fine, maybe I do, but ask yourself what would itch under your skin if your sister posted a caption that read, "Family is everything," under a photo taken in your living room, using your string lights and your playlist, and still managed to crop you out by accident, which is its own funny phrase because how many accidental crops does it take before someone admits it is the whole point? I decided I would not beg to be included anymore. I would test the hypothesis that they did not need me, and if they truly did not, then the universe would keep spinning without a wobble, and if they did, then the wobble would tell me everything I needed to know. By midweek, I had scaled from careful edits to a broader project, writing a script that targeted facial clustering so that any time a photo recognized me, it flagged itself for removal, and while the technical part sounds like a flex, it actually felt like washing dishes, one plate and then the next, except the sink never emptied because the albums reached backward through years and device upgrades and seasonal traditions, and for every holiday where I could pick myself out by the sweater color, or the boots or the ring I wore then, I found another candid where I was a background blur with a trash bag or a stack of folding chairs. Each deletion left behind a little vacuum, a tug of air, a rearranged balance that made the picture strangely better for them. Because the remaining people looked like they had always been the only ones, which was the problem and also the point. I did not stop with photos, because a good experiment uses multiple data sources, so I reviewed text threads too, those family chats where plans are made and jokes die and apologies are telegraphed with puppies. And I downloaded the lot before anyone could discover that I was archiving them for future use. Then I scheduled a series of posts that would roll out while they were away, harmless little updates on my alleged study grind, complete with cheerful sentences about coffee and chapter summaries and a few self-deprecating jokes about being the boring helper who keeps the household running, and although the posts looked like normal life, they were timed to sync with the private edits I made so that when my mother glanced at her phone after dinner, as she always did, she would see my innocuous message while the album in the next tab processed another batch of pictures where my existence evaporated like breath on glass. On Thursday evening, when the resort's live music filtered into their videos and the sky behind them went gold, I finished the last planned pass through our history and sat on the floor of my room with the lamp on low, noticing how empty the house sounded without the little friction of other people, and it occurred to me that emptiness can be an instrument, not just a condition, because when you remove yourself from a picture, you do not simply vanish, you create questions. You make silence the loudest thing in the room, and that is how I knew the experiment deserved one more step, something neat and reversible and just pointed enough to sting without drawing blood. So I packed an overnight bag with the basics, left my phone where it could be easily found, and walked out into the late summer dark with my heart tapping fast, not afraid exactly, just keenly awake in a way that felt overdue. They wanted me to focus on my studies, and I had, though the subject turned out to be them, and the test would be graded the moment they returned to a house that looked familiar but did not fit, because the drawers were a touch too tidy. And the dust on my bookshelf carried the shape of a missing book, and the shared album would show a family that looked untroubled by the absence of the one person who handled the long drives and the late dishes and the awkward silences, which is to say the person who makes a family look easy. When they opened the door on Sunday, they would find the kettle warm and the bedroom staged and the phones buzzing with messages they did not want to read. And while they called my name and tried to decide whether to panic or to manage the optics, they would realize that an even stranger thing had happened on their sunny trip, because somewhere between the beach and the driveway, their history swallowed a small but necessary shape. And with it went all the proof that I had ever been there, which, if you think about it, is the kind of trick you only pull once, and I had made sure it would land exactly where it hurt. By the time their car rolled back into the driveway with that tired crunch of gravel that always follows a long highway return, the house had already learned a new personality, because while they performed their resort smiles into other people's lenses, I treated our quiet rooms like a stage set and moved the props a finger's width at a time until the familiar cues misfired. The muscle memory broke, and every habitual gesture landed on air, which is a petty description if you want to keep this tidy, yet an honest one if you have ever been told to be grateful for leftovers while someone posts a toast to family unity under your porch lights. The pantry looked stocked until you tried to build dinner and realized the pasta boxes were empty sleeves with carefully sealed bottoms. The smart speaker still answered, but only to a changed wake word that no one in this house had ever used. The living room frames continued to rotate family slideshows, yet somehow cycled through sequences where the spacing felt wrong in a way you cannot immediately diagnose, and the Wi-Fi name, which had been a bland model number since installation day, now greeted every returning device with a cheerful directive that read like an inside joke none of them wanted to explain. I had not trashed anything, because I was not after destruction, I was after disorientation. That slippery space where people who believe themselves unshakable begin to notice how much of their certainty depends on the quiet labor of whoever they decided was supporting cast, and once that recognition seeps in, you can choose whether to show mercy or to let the lesson breathe. I chose a measured breath, which is why the shared cloud albums behaved normally until anyone tried to open a year at random, at which point the album would politely fail to load those particular memories and offer a message about a permissions mismatch, the kind of harmless glitch that drives non-technical people to text a relative for help. Except in our case, the helper was supposed to be me, and I was not there, so the backlog of small problems began to coagulate into a single heavy thing, which is an old truth of households and a truth my mother recognized first, because she is the one who pretends systems appear spontaneously while also knowing, deep down, whose hands keep them upright. I had also thought about the audience beyond our front door, since so much of their life has always been crafted for other people's consumption, and while I did not want to humiliate anyone with a public speech, satisfying in fantasy, cheap in practice, I did want to adjust the lighting in their theater, so I scheduled a series of innocuous posts to roll out from my accounts that sounded like the sort of earnest updates everyone scrolls past without comment, small notes about reorganizing shelves, and taking a break from screens and trying a slow cooker recipe, with each caption holding a breadcrumb so faint you would miss it unless you knew where to look, a phrasing that echoed a family catchphrase or a half-joke from some long-ago road trip. And on the same afternoons I queued those posts, I also timed the photo frames to surface specific holidays that would look oddly incomplete without me, not because I wanted relatives to accuse them of anything, but because I wanted the question to bloom in the room like a scent. Where is she, and why are the edges of these pictures too neat? Brooke felt it second, because people like my sister traffic in optics the way fishermen read the surface of water, and she noticed within an hour that her favorite festival shot had been lightly rebalanced so that her laugh played as slightly meaner than she remembered, not because the pixels changed her mouth, but because the absence of the person holding the kettle in the background turned the laughter from affectionate to triumphant, and when she pulled up the album to confirm, the grid hiccuped and rerouted her to a different year where the same absence performed the same trick on a different day. I could almost hear her in my head, saying the word creepy even while she tried to keep the tone bright. And I am not proud of how much I enjoyed imagining that small frown, except I am also not sorry, because there is a difference between cruelty and consequence, and for once I was not the one making the former to avoid the latter. My father came last to the party, as men like him usually do, because nothing breaks until a bill arrives, and while I had no interest in wrecking our finances, I did take back the parts of our household economy that had been quietly sitting on my accounts for convenience, which in practice meant that the streaming service's many public declarations of family movie night depended on now produced a polite login error. The garden service asked for a new card, and the storage unit that held years of holiday decorations under a code only I remembered sent a two-step verification text to a phone that lay face-up on my neatly made bed, which is the sort of administrative snag that wears away at dignity because it turns grown adults into supplicants, not to a bank or a landlord, but to the person they framed as always available, and if the lesson stung, then perhaps it was far past due. Before you claim that I was running some melodramatic heist, let me say that I left safety nets everywhere, because I am not a villain and because my revenge is not about pain, it is about recognition. So I printed a single sheet for each of them with the passwords they would need, sealed the sheets in envelopes with their names, and tucked the envelopes into obvious places where a person would find them only after looking for a while. Not because I wanted to watch them squirm, but because I wanted them to feel, even briefly, the effort it takes to keep a machine running without applause. In Brooke's envelope, I included a short note reminding her where the line is between snark and gentleness, and that the line matters. And in my father's, I added a line about budgeting for 3 instead of 4 without pretending it is the same. And in my mother's, I wrote that I know she loves us in a language that often comes out as command, and that I hope one day she learns translation. Meanwhile, the neighborhood chorus started warming up, because neighborhoods always do, and our closest neighbor, who belongs to the kind of church where casseroles double as dispatches, saw my parents unloading suitcases and called across the driveway to ask whether I enjoyed the trip, which forced my mother to perform a small stumble while Brooke checked her phone as if the right answer might be stored in there, and although I was not there to see it, I have been around long enough to know how the choreography goes when a family tries to change the subject without a subject to change to, and I will admit that the thought of that little stage play kept me company while I ate a late dinner somewhere that is none of your business. Which is not meant as coyness, but as a boundary finally held. As the evening settled, the frames obligingly shifted to autumn, then winter, then spring again, and the house, robbed of its autopilot, grew strangely formal, the way a hotel room does when the party has ended and the staff has not yet arrived. And in that formal hush, the last piece of the plan woke up, a scheduled push to our extended family's private archive with a new album title that carried my sister's exact cadence, Family Minus Distractions, attached to her user by a permissions quirk. She would have to publicly deny before she could privately fix it, which is not a hammer blow but a chisel, a gentle yet unignorable pressure that cracks a larger stone. When the alerts chimed and their phones began to buzz in messy unison, my mother's voice, which is softer when she is frightened, carried up the stairs as she asked for me by the nickname she only uses in emergencies, and my father said my full name like a courtroom, and Brooke muttered something about optics while she stabbed at her screen, and that is when the doorbell rang with the neighbor's second casserole and a question that would not leave the porch. If she is not in the photos and she is not in the house, then where exactly is she, and who decided that was okay? Morning in our town has a way of sounding falsely gentle, with sprinklers clicking like patient metronomes and delivery vans exhaling at the curb as if they are tamed animals rather than deadlines on wheels. And while that choreography replayed itself outside our windows, the inside of the house shifted from irritated confusion to something closer to dread dressed in business casual. Because once the neighbor's casserole cooled on the counter and my mother ran out of bright explanations to offer the porch, they had to confront the simple fact that the person who usually decodes the family's tangled laces was not here to tug at the knots, and that absence, which they had always treated like an aesthetic choice in photos, behaved more like a structural load when no one stepped in to carry it, which is when people discovered that the pillar they painted the color of the wall also held up the roof. They searched the way people who hate mess search, tidying as they worried, smoothing the comforter on my bed even though they needed it pulled apart, aligning the books on my shelf despite the obvious rectangle of dust where one was missing. That single hardback with a plain gray jacket I took not because I needed to read it again, but because I wanted the absence to say its quiet piece, and in their rummaging they found my phone in the obvious place like a staged clue, which would have been a comfort if the notifications rolling across its screen had not formed their own chorus, card update requests, subscription access reminders, and that particular hell of family group chat pings where relatives toggle between concern and gossip with the agility of gymnasts, and when my mother, who believes privacy is for the ungrateful, opened my messages to look for a simple explanation. She met the scheduled outbox I had left like a string of breadcrumbs, cheerful notes about studying and baking and organizing, each light as dandelion fluff and each paired, invisibly to her, with a time change somewhere else, an album permission here, a smart frame rotation there, that together rewrote the house as a place where their authority had lost its password. Brooke began with the mirror, because of course she did, standing in the doorway of my room as if proximity might produce insight while she scrolled through the shapeless panic on her phone. Noticing with growing irritation that friends had commented on the resort photos in a tone that felt wrong, a hair too sharp, a smirk where she expected a wink, and when she tried to show my mother what she meant. The shared album killed the moment by refusing to load the year she wanted, shunting her. Sideways to another season where our porch pumpkins gleamed, my father sculpted his earnest grin, and the shadow in the kitchen window did not exist because I had wiped it, which left a composition that told a different story than the one she remembered. A story where the girl who carried the heavy gourds and did the dishes after the cider spill was not present enough to be thanked, which would be fine if it had been a one-off oversight. Yet the pattern repeated and repetition tells the truth. Even when no one wants to hear it. My father defaulted to logistics, that comforting fiction that a family can be fixed with a spreadsheet, making calls to the storage unit and the garden service and the cable provider. Speaking in the voice menus when they want to sound reasonable while they are 2 minutes from shouting, only to learn that every polite representative he reached required a 2-factor code or an identity confirmation for the person on the account, which in our case was me because convenience had, over the years, become delegation, and while he tried to frame this as a silly mix-up, he could not hide the way his mouth tightened when a manager cheerfully suggested he ask his daughter to authorize him. A sentence that showed him a portrait of himself he did not want to look at, namely a man who outsourced the family's invisible tasks to the person he also called dramatic when she asked for some gratitude with the labor. There was a moment at noon when the house inhaled and held it, the way a stage does in the beat before the curtain rises, and that breath stretched because the doorbell rang again and my mother, who had put on lipstick like armor, opened to find not a neighbor with a casserole but a courier with a heavy, square package addressed to the family in the exact font Brooke uses for party invitations, the sort of detail that makes denial feel slippery, and when they cut the tape and lifted the lid. The room filled with the smell of new paper and ink, a scent as intimate as a new notebook on the first day of school, except this was not a blank beginning, it was a hardbound photo book with a simple white cover that read Family Study, which if you have a sense of humor at all you will recognize as both a pun and an indictment, because inside the pages are life unspooled across years of birthdays and barbecues and holidays, yet on every spread the captions carried a quiet bite, clean and factual, identifying the setting, the occasion, and the labor required to make it happen, followed by the same 2 words in italics, labor, redacted, where my name should have gone. While small gray footnotes noted the grocery runs and the driving routes and the RSVP follow-ups in a tone so polite it could not be accused of meanness, and on the back flap, tucked into a pocket like a library card, were 3 receipts for recurring family services paid through my accounts, folded neatly with a simple line, handwritten in each crease, please update to reflect your household. You might hate me at this point, which I accept, because not everyone appreciates the flavor of justice served so cold it fogs the plate, and I will not argue if you say this looks like pettiness wrapped in a graduate project. But I will tell you that I chose paper and ink for a reason, because unlike screens that flicker and can be denied with a shrug about glitches, a book sits on a table with weight and resists erasure, and because I knew my family would be tempted to pretend this was a misunderstanding produced by dirty Wi-Fi or a mean-spirited hacker, I included on the inside cover a dedication line that quoted their own favorite directive, focus on your studies, beneath which I wrote, in small print, thank you I did, followed by a QR code not linked to any public humiliation or online confession, but to a private video accessible only with a passphrase they all know even if they have never admitted it. The silly nickname my grandfather used to call us when we bickered, and I timed that video to unlock not immediately but at sunset, because I wanted the house to sit with the book all afternoon like a stern guest no one could ignore. While they circled the table with the tight steps of people avoiding a tripwire, my email performed its own quiet trick, sending a message to our extended family list with the subject line study update and a body so bland it melted into inboxes. A few lines about reorganizing and rest and taking a break from social media, punctuated with a single embedded image of a page from the book where Brooke's bridal shower gleamed without me, the caption noting, "Without heat," that someone ordered, fetched, carried, and staged the 72 cupcakes no one photographed. And if you think that is a cheap shot, you may have never been the person whose worth is measured in tasks completed rather than names remembered, and perhaps you were lucky, though luck makes poor proof against a lifetime of being cropped. As afternoon slid toward evening and the sun pressed its long rectangles across our floors, the house took on that tense, museum hush that arrives when objects suddenly appear to contain arguments. The frames on the walls showing family joy that now looked curated to the point of fakery, the book on the table insisting that a narrative requires an author and that erasing authorship has consequences, and in that silence the doorbell rang again. Not with a neighbor and not with a courier, but with a uniformed officer performing a welfare check requested by a friend whose name they recognized too well because she lives 2 streets over and has watched our family for years with eyes kind enough to help and sharp enough to finally ask. And while my parents performed indignation and Brooke performed confidence, the officer did what officers do, which is write down times and dates and the words people choose when they are nervous, and the revenge, if you choose to call it that, arrived not in the badge at the door but in the ledger on the clipboard, because it required my family to say out loud that they had not spoken to me for days while they were away at a resort where the cocktails were bottomless and the captions moralized about togetherness. And the admission landed in the foyer with the same dull weight as the photo book on the table, giving the house a matched set. When the officer left and the light finally went thin, my mother touched the cover of the book as if it were a hot stove, and my father stared at the QR code as though it might blink first, and Brooke, whose gallery of expressions rarely includes humility, whispered the passphrase under her breath and said we should just watch whatever this is and be done with it. And if I tell you that the video, when it finally bloomed onto the television, did not open with my face, but with a still of the beach resort postcard our neighbor stuck to our fridge, then perhaps you will understand that questions, once invited in, multiply like rabbits, and that tonight's rabbits were only the small ones. Because the last frame froze on a title card in my handwriting that read Part 1, followed by a timestamp she recognized from the metadata on her own photos and a location tag none of them expected to see associated with me, which is to say a place they never imagined I would go without them, and which is also to say the surprise I saved for tomorrow. I had timed the video to unlock at sunset because houses like ours grow honest when the light thins, and as the television filled with the postcard image and then dissolved into motion, the first sound they heard was not my voice, but the salted thump of waves and the distant clatter of resort plates, that percussion you only notice when you are sitting alone with your back to the show. And then the frame steadied on a boardwalk view shot from an angle my family never used, low and patient. Pointed not at their curated smiles, but at the edges where workers cleared tables and kids melted down and the illusion frayed, which is my way of saying the location tag they had not expected was the same resort they had posted from all week. Except the timestamp said the day after they left, and the voice that finally entered did not brag about a solo escape, but spoke quietly about planning and routes and the odd comfort of driving through the night with a thermos and a deadline, because if you are going to vanish, it helps to do it by walking straight into the photograph everyone else thinks they own. The camera panned across the beach with none of their bounce, favoring the unflattering things families delete, the damp towels abandoned after a posed sunset, the plastic novelty cups abandoned like gossip. The way the wind resets every message written in sand even when the letters are stubborn, and then it slid to a chaise where I sat in a plain t-shirt and a hat borrowed from a gas station rack, looking like a version of myself who had finally scrubbed off a layer of performative good behavior. I explained, without drama and with more detail than they wanted, that I had booked one night with the points I earned from years of family travel arrangements, that the night clerk had upgraded me with the bored kindness of people who know a tired face when they see it, and that I chose the room facing the boardwalk because I did not come for a vacation, I came for proof, the kind that reduces arguments rather than inflaming them, and while I spoke, the video overlaid stills from their posts. With the same backgrounds shifted by hours, positioning my body where theirs had been, not to mock them, but to demonstrate a simple, infuriating fact. The place made room for me the second I decided I did not need their permission. If the resort footage had been the whole show, they could have written it off as a stunt, but the second section opened on a quiet lobby where a concierge swiped through the hotel's public event shots and identified by first name the staff who took them. And as he talked about schedules and the way families who perform togetherness often tip poorly because generosity is a private act for people who do not need an audience, a small stack of printed forms sat on the counter like an afterthought. I did not make them beg to know what the papers were, because I am not cruel, so I said plainly that they were records requests and notarized letters, dull little tools that open locked drawers, and that I had filed them precisely. Not to stir scandal, but to gather the kind of receipts that do not shout, they hum, and I let the hum linger as the video cut to me in a post office mailing heavy envelopes addressed to 3 places that shape reputations in small American towns. Our church office. The neighborhood association that loves bylaws more than birthdays, and the alumni office at the school my parents parade like a family crest, because if you want people who worship optics to recognize the cost of cropping, you show them a paper trail rather than a tantrum. The next section unsettled them more than the paper, which surprised and also delighted me, because it featured faces they did not expect to see on our television. Familiar people whose names live in my mother's contacts under neat labels like choir and book club and neighbors with the good roses, speaking in short clips I recorded with permission, each recalling a moment when I had shown up to carry something heavy or fix something no one else could be bothered to learn, and each ending with the same question offered without accusation and without my coaching: where is she, and why is she not in any of your pictures? Because we saw her there, and we remember the way she laughed at the children's table or the way she managed the ticket list when the speaker arrived late, and we do not understand how a person ends up missing in an album unless someone wants them missing. Which is a brutal sentence delivered in polite voices that never raise above kitchen volume, and it worked better than any speech I could have made because it did not declare a verdict. It opened a door and asked them to walk through it on their own legs. While they absorbed the testimonies, the book still sat on the table like a judge, and the frames on the walls continued their unsmiling rotation, and into that machinery I slipped the part that made all of this more than performance. Because I had been preparing for months in a slow, adult way that does not trend, meeting with a lawyer who does not post online and a counselor who documents rather than waves sage, and together we had built a modest plan with dull, stubborn parts, updated healthcare directives, a change in beneficiaries for the services I funded, a safe deposit key they could only use with me present, and though I did not flash the details across the screen like a scoreboard, I let the video show the edges of letters with state seals and the signatures that matter when holidays roll back around and someone reaches for the old script about what daughters owe, and you can call that transactional if you want. But I call it teaching a household to do the math on affection and labor without pretending there is no ledger. If revenge must arrive each time like a knife twist, then here is the neat little turn you might appreciate even if you hate me, because before the video ended I sent one last scheduled bundle into the world. A series of quiet updates placed where my family could not yank them back. One to the church bulletin with a note thanking unnamed volunteers who work unseen and asking readers to thank their own invisible people this week. One to the homeowners forum with a motion to create a shared resources list so that every house knows who handles what chores and what breaks when that person is gone, and one to a closed alumni group recounting a story from a campus job that taught me how much of an institution's glory is built on uncredited hands, ending with a generous invitation for people to share their own names for the unthanked, and within minutes of those posts landing, replies began to flower in places my mother reads with devotional regularity, replies that did not call out my family by name, because I had never named them, but that nevertheless drew a map whose streets looked very familiar. As the video's final minute began, the screen went black except for a single line of white text that read, "You cannot delete a memory someone else keeps," and then my voice returned, softer than before because I was tired and because sincerity, when not weaponized, makes people listen, and I told them I would not be returning tonight, that I was safe, that I wanted them to experience the friction of tasks I used to make smooth, and that I would not respond to any message that started with explanation or ended with denial, yet I would answer anything that began with a question honest enough to be ugly, and when the line faded, the room remained full of sound anyway. The beep of their phones lighting up with bulletin replies and association notifications, and the small chorus of relatives offering opinions they had disguised as prayers. You might think that last flourish was my final gift, but it was only the wrapping. The actual gift was already installed in a place they cared about more than they admit. Something woven into the local record that shapes how people remember a family long after the party photos are pulped, and although I will not name it yet because I like to keep one card face down, I will tell you that when Brooke's phone vibrated again, and she glanced at the screen and went pale in a way I have only seen twice, she turned to my parents with a look that mixed admiration, panic, and the faintest slice of respect, and she said, in a voice that could not carry its usual smirk, that I had done something they could not edit or explain away or bury under a stack of new posts, and that from tomorrow forward the gap where I should have been would be visible not just in our frames, but in the place that files our stories, which is when my father, who dislikes metaphors almost as much as he dislikes losing control, asked the only question that mattered, what did she change, and my mother, whose face had fallen into the lines of real fear, whispered the word obituary as if it were a curse, not because I had died, but because I had written one where a different kind of death is recorded, the death of a narrative that pretended I was optional, and because they did not yet know whose name was printed in that column tomorrow. The obituary landed on doorsteps with the morning paper that still arrives because my father believes ink keeps a town honest, and while the front page did its daily theater with weather and school board skirmishes, the column that made my mother sit down before coffee wore a headline that looked like a joke to anyone who did not live in our house, in loving memory of the person who did the unseen work, followed by a graceful paragraph that refused melodrama while cataloging, with maddening precision, the kinds of labor no one photographs, a lineage of errands, reminders, late-night pickups, last-minute costume fixes, grocery sprints in storm weather, tech rescues during streaming crashes, and holiday logistics that keep traditions from shattering on the floor, and although the text never used my legal name, it borrowed every echo of me it needed, then closed with a line that sounded like a bell, survived by those who thought the work did itself, and a small request in lieu of flowers that donations be made to a newly formed community fund supporting uncredited caregivers, the sort of quiet engine that will not trend yet will outlast a dozen beach posts, which is not a slam on funds so much as a correction of gravity. You could argue this was theatrical or cruel, yet the truth is that nothing in that column was false or even unkind, and the names attached to the fund were not mine, but those of the women who taught me patience, the neighbor with the roses who watched me teach her grandson how to reset a router without touching the panic button, the choir alto who loaned me her car when our trunk latch gave up an hour before Thanksgiving, the bookstore clerk who put aside the last plain white candles because she knew our mother hates scented ones, and if you are wondering who signed off on placing a living obituary where actual losses are mourned, I will tell you that the paper's editor is a woman who has fielded decades of men complaining about font sizes while she rewrote their punctuation. And she did not need me to explain the purpose, because she recognized it the moment she saw the dedication line for all who go missing in the narrative while staying present in the work. The revenge, if we must keep calling it that, did not end with the sting of public recognition, because I have no interest in living inside a victory lap, so I sent a single message to my family with none of my usual cushioning and none of their keywords. A message that spelled out terms as calmly as any service renewal. I am safe, I need time, I will speak with you when questions replace performances, and in the meantime the envelopes you found contain every credential you require to stand on your own feet, while the fund will carry my name nowhere and will accept your contributions if you wish to honor a person you were certain you valued, but frequently erased. Then, because punishment without education is pointless and education without practice dissolves into slogans, I added a link to a shared calendar I created for them alone, labeled with the same harried tasks that used to materialize without anyone planning them. trash night disguised as magic, dog grooming disguised as luck. Renewal dates disguised as autopilot, and I set the permissions so that any completed task would mark itself publicly for a month in a tiny family circle where optics have no power and results do. They did not reply immediately, which I expected and also respected, since people who live by the story of themselves must suffer the awkwardness of discovering they have been reading from the wrong draft. And while I waited, I let myself do something unfashionably sentimental, which was to revisit the old albums in a copy no one can alter anymore, not to restore myself to every frame as a triumph of self-esteem, but to observe with clinical tenderness how often I reached for the heavy end of the thing and how rarely anyone noticed, and then to decide, without bitterness, but with high clarity, that my life could afford a boundary thicker than a crop line, one with keys and locks and choices that belong to me whether or not anyone claps. Around noon my phone, which I had left blessedly silent while the world did its buzzing, blinked twice with messages that did not insult either of us with excuses, and although I will not quote them because humility deserves privacy, I will say that my father wrote fewer words than he has ever written to me, and each one landed like a sturdy object placed on a table rather than a flourish tossed in the air, and my mother, who has always spoken in directives because that is the only emotional language anyone taught her, asked a question that did not pretend she knew the answer, and my sister, who can turn any apology into a brand if someone does not stop her, resisted the spin for once and sent me proof that she had moved tasks into her name without announcing it to her followers, which might be nothing to you, but felt to me like a hinge finally oiled. As for where I am and whether I come back to the house that trained me to serve and then to vanish, I will answer that I am learning the shape of a life that is not built to be cropped. A life that spends money on boring things like boundaries and on selfish things like silence and on generous things like funds that help people whose names are not printed anywhere except on the envelopes they open at midnight to keep a household from falling apart. And I will not dramatize that private geography by mapping it for anyone. I will say only that the day ends with a sky the color of stainless steel and that I keep the book on a shelf where I can reach it but do not need to. And that the frames in my apartment cycle through pictures I take for myself with no audience in mind, and that when someone, someday, asks whether I regret making the column and the book and the video and the calendar and the quiet new rules, I will answer, if I answer at all, that I regret waiting so long to study the obvious, namely that you cannot be erased by people who finally learn to see that you can choose to remain slightly out of frame, where the air is clear and the narrative breathes, and where the last question belongs not to them but to me.